Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our dear friend, Herb Kagan. Herb is continuing to lead us through the 12 steps with a spiritual and emotional sobriety focus that's adding important dimension to our recovery processes. He's going to start exploring step 11 tonight, and tonight is all about meditation or directed thinking, with a focus on emotional sobriety. We really are quite happy to have her back with us again. And I know that this is a step that he dearly loves and is exceptionally talented at sharing his information about it to help us grow. So I turn it over to Herb, and I can't wait to hear everything you have to say. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Susie. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, perfect.
Right, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and the invitation and opportunity to come back next year. I think that it's going to be fun, but it's also going to be a wonderful experience, both for Alan and I do believe anybody who chooses to show up. My name is Herb, and I am definitely an alcoholic. This is Pathetic Herbie. Didn't know that he didn't know. Definitely had been in jail due to my alcoholism, but didn't know that, the reason. And even when I was invited to stop drinking, a story for a different day, and I haven't had a drink since February 21st, 1984, I got free of the bondage of addiction, a grace I didn't ask for, and I did no work for. Again, a story for a different day. But I was still in bondage of unmanageability. I make that distinction because Bill does in step 1 with a dash. There's no and there. The best kept secret in the rooms, I'm going to keep saying it because it just resonates with my experience currently. Unmanageability is the spiritual malady. Unmanageability is the problem. Oh, alcohol addiction. Alcohol, substance addiction, drugs and alcohol and food, perhaps. Process addiction, there's hundreds actually. And 12-step fellowships reflect that. Over 100 different 12-step fellowships. But addiction is a problem. It's the suffering that brings us to a 12-step program, usually. But most people, a large percentage of people, maybe not most, have never really encountered what does it mean, unmanageability? What does Bill mean, not cured? What does Bill mean, daily reprieve? We're in the secret sauce now, assuming that you have some relationship with the bedevilments on page 52, some experience with the description of why we have bedevilments, pages 60 to 62. If you haven't, I suggest you read that second paragraph on page 52 in the personal pronoun and present tense. And you read pages 60 to 62 in the personal pronoun present tense. If you haven't done that before, please be seated because you might just faint. It's such a powerful experience. So steps 11 and 12, 10, 11, and 12, Bill says we enter the world of the spirit. Well, where have we been? We've been in the world of self. We've dealt effectively with the allergy and craving because we've been given the abstinence, the gift of abstinence, by finishing the 9th step. Bill's very clear on page 84. We have been placed, a grace, in the position of neutrality. I am quoting. a position of neutrality. We're not drinking. I'm going to stay with the language of alcohol because that's my experience. You can broaden it based on your own need for a different vocabulary and your experience. The allergy and craving are not relevant because I'm not drinking. I've been given the gift of freedom from the obsession and the delusion. So my mind has been restored to sanity. That's what that means. If you have any doubt about the big book's definition of sanity, look it up. Page 37. Bill gives us his own definition of sanity. Healthy thinking, a perspective. My terms, now I'll try to make a distinction between big book vocabulary and my vocabulary, is we've been given a spiritual shield. A shield so our will stays in alignment. Susie mentioned emotional sobriety. That's the connection here. Steps 10, 11, and 12. I do believe step 10 is the tool of emotional sobriety, and steps 11 and 12, at least using some vocabulary that makes a distinction there. And it's mine. It's not precise. It's certainly not science. But steps 11 and 12 are spiritual sobriety, using my will correctly. We have recovered, Bill says it in the title page of the big book, how thousands of men and women have recovered. I don't want to get into a discussion, certainly not heated, about recovering and recovery, but Bill doesn't use those terms. In the big book, consistently and predominantly, he uses the term recovered past tense because it's just not an issue anymore if you've done the first 9 steps and completed the first 9 steps. Not perfectly. Progress, not perfection. Most of you know, if you've heard me at all, that I did the steps 3 different times with 3 different men over a 10-year period. It was a progressive revelation. It was a progressive transformation. I didn't know that I could expect that. I didn't even know it was happening when it was happening. I only know what I know from experience and when I pause for a minute and look back over my shoulder. I have physical sobriety before I ever came to AA. I sat in the rooms going to a meeting every day, talking to my sponsor every day for 4 years and not changing. I didn't know what Bill meant by not cured. I didn't know what Bill meant by daily reprieve. It was not relevant to me because I just didn't have any issue with alcohol and addiction. And I didn't know that I didn't know I had an issue. I had a daily issue with unmanageability, but since restless, irritable, and discontent was my way of life, that was the only thing I ever knew. Not knowing that I was restless, irritable, and discontent because it was a state of being. And it was only when I began doing this work in 1988, 4 years sober, that I began to thaw out sufficiently inside so that I was able to distinguish between restless, irritable, and discontent and a sense of contentment, what we're beginning to call emotional sobriety. Bill calls it our way of life. We commenced this way of life as we cleaned up the past. I give the instructions based on that suggestion from the big book, a literal suggestion. We commenced to clean up the past as we commenced our way of life. We commenced this way of life as we cleaned up the past. I want to get the words correct from the big book. So I give the instructions on 10, 11, and 12 when people have completed their 8th step and are prepared to do their 9th step. And as they do their 9th step, they're living our way of life. We covered in October 2 different aspects of step 10. Emotional sobriety, the spot check inventory that Bill talks about in the 12 and 12 chapter 10. If you haven't read that, it is the Rosetta Stone that unlocks the formula that Bill gives us in the big book. The 12 and 12 is essential to understand the proper use, from my standpoint, the intended use of step 10. But today we're going to talk about step 11, clearing the channel. I love the word channel from the prayer of St. Francis, make me a channel. I'm a channel of light. I'm a channel of grace. I'm a channel of God. Those are the poetic thoughts that I have in attempting to understand this process. The spot check inventory removes the clouds that block the sunlight deep down in me from me. And so in the step 11, we fill the channel with God, with grace, with light. Right? Keep in mind that kind of poetic imagery really helps me understand the necessity of and the power of steps 10, 11, and 12. Next month, December, I'll be talking about the various aspects of step 12, emptying the channel. The light gets in through the wounds. It's a great poem. Somebody sent it to me based on my conversation in step 10, I believe, Anthem. The light gets in us through our wounds, but at the same time, it gets out from us through our wounds. Bill says our liabilities can become our best assets. I changed the word in step 12 from service, which we use regularly, and it's a great word, but I like the word help. How can I be helpful? More about that next month. I want to focus on step 11 today. And then 2 weeks from now, I want to focus on a very different process. Step 11 in the big book is about meditation. Next time we get together, I want to talk about contemplation. It's a fancy word. Look it up in the dictionary. It comes from the Latin word. Well, your dictionaries were probably inadequate, quite frankly. When you look up the word meditation, it uses sometimes the word contemplation. So they actually are not very precise, at least in the dictionaries I've looked at. Meditation in the dictionary says directed thinking, the use of my mind to reflect, to think, to discern, to come through a set of problems or a set of facts to some type of a rational conclusion. Very active process, using my mind to think, using my mind to think. Bill says, in fact, it's the proper use of the mind. He knew. Unfortunately, there's been some confusion in the Western world, the entire Western world, because the Eastern world came to us and didn't understand the English language. It's their second language, I'm assuming. And they didn't look up in any clear way in dictionaries about the definitions of what they were trying to do and express and teach the Western world their practice. Their practice is contemplation, not meditation, but they used the term meditation, so the Western world adopted it, not knowing, again, the accurate definition of the vocabulary. I don't really care what the words are, but I do like to understand words because they have some precision here in the distinction. Meditation is uniquely different than contemplation. I mean, diametrically, a completely different methodology, same purpose in the largest sense, and that is to improve our consciousness. Meditation is to think about it and become conscious. Contemplation is to sit quietly in the presence of energy, whatever that means to you, that power, that God, that light, to be transformed. Meditation, directed thinking, contemplation comes from the Latin templare, meaning temple space. the house of God, the house of the divine, the house of the spirit, tabernacle, church, cathedral, mosque, synagogue, doesn't matter, living room, wherever you sit quietly to be in the presence of. That's contemplation, with no mind, with emptiness, with distance from the mind. Again, I'll spend some time on it in 2 weeks. Both of them are connected to all of what I'm talking about, to emotional sobriety. Well, what is it? You ask yourself, do you have a sense of well-being today, right now, as I'm talking to you? Just ask, am I in a sense of joy in my life? Do I have a sense of balance and contentment? If the answer is not really, okay, you can benefit from certainly the first 9 steps will bring you and deliver you. Hear the words, deliver you. Bill says we get into the rocket, right? Rocketed into a 4th dimension. That's what we're talking about here. 4th dimension, the world of the spirit, the world of the immaterial. Our way of living turned. We make a decision in step 3, a commitment actually of action to be turned, to turn rather, and we experience that we are turned. We commit to turning, and we do steps 4 through 9 with a lot of work on our part. And at some point, maybe at the end of step 9, we look back over our shoulder and we see that we were turned from the disease to at easeness. We are delivered from our disease problem of addiction to our at ease experience of emotional sobriety. We release our resentments. We begin to trust ourselves and trust life and trust other people. We begin to. It's a process guided by principles in all our affairs. I'll talk more about that definitely in step 12. A program of rigorous honesty. Bill spends the first 2/3 of page 58, the first page of chapter 5, how it works, talking about various aspects of honesty and rigorous honesty as crucial. Honesty with myself, honesty with others, especially with myself. That's my Achilles heel, I think. Being transparent. Beginning to now experience freedom from the bondage of addiction and the bondage of self. The bondage of self is the definition of unmanageability. Dr. Berger's also conducting a series on a weekly basis on self-esteem and emotional sobriety and the steps. On Thursday night, probably Susie and Patrick have more information about that. The difference, as one author described it, is willfulness, that is my self-centeredness, versus willingness, which is the key to the proper use of my will. No, that's a definition. What is willingness? It's the exercise of my will to be willing, to be willing, to be willing. It might be remote, but the witness to my willingness is the movement of my feet, my action. The use of my free will is in both cases. I bring on my unmanageability because I take acts contrary to principles. I bring on emotional sobriety because I use my free will to take actions contrary to my will and my habits and my desires and my wants and my feelings. Acts contrary. Amazing process. When we begin to do differently, we begin to think differently. When we begin to do differently, we begin to feel differently. And now it's really good science. I use the term for step 3 as alignment, making a decision to align my will with reality. When I'm in my unmanageability, I'm out of alignment with reality. That's as simple as it gets. When I'm attempting to be and are actually in alignment with reality, my life flows. Bill uses the term flow in the big book. I've been really leaning into that word in the last couple of years as my spiritual practice, being in the flow of life, being in the flow of reality. This is emotional sobriety. It's in step 10, it's a conscience practice, learning to exercise awareness of principles and practice these principles based on the signals I get from my feelings, aware of the disturbance, like the yellow flashing light on the dashboard of my car. It just tells me there's trouble. It's not it's potentially negative if I ignore the signal. So I have to take responsibility for the alignment. Maslow calls this, he's a psychologist that I've adopted his model of human development. He calls it self-actualization. Dr. Berger calls it the actualization of the true self, the deconstruction of the false self, the deconstruction of the wall that we built cinder block by cinder block as a delusional attempt to protect ourselves, a wall to protect ourselves. And we discovered by the end of the 9th step that it was a wall that imprisoned us. So we enter into the world of spiritual sobriety by my definition. This isn't coming from the big book, some of these terms, but it helps me understand the organic nature of the steps. Bill asks us to grow in understanding and effectiveness, to improve our conscious contact in step 11, and to enlarge our compassion in step 12. I use the two terms, improve and enlarge, because they're in the big book. Improve is in the step itself. That's the real purpose. You want to know the mission of step 11, meditation. It has only one purpose: to improve my conscious contact. I use the term enlarge for step 12 because it breaks the code for Jim, the car salesman that put a little whiskey in his milk on page 35, who says he failed to enlarge his spiritual life. But we don't know what it means from that context. But earlier on in Bill's story, on page 14, at the very bottom, he says, we perfect and enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. These are the kind of organic things in the big book that reveals Bill's thinking about what he means by different words and different phrases. I see this as spiritual sobriety. The image there on the PowerPoint is intended to communicate a coin having two sides. You see how organically connected step 11 and 12 are. And quite frankly, step 10 is really an integral part of step 11, as Bill points out in the 12 and 12, hand in glove, he calls them. Inventory is part of 11. And in fact, he starts out step 11 in the big book, pages 85 to 88. He starts out by giving us inventory, what we do at night. He has just given us the directions on step 10, what we do all day long. So he immediately gives us what we do at night because we finished our day. And at night, we ask ourselves, well, how did we do? Did we miss the opportunity to do step 10? Well, now you have another opportunity with inventory when we retire at night. So step 11 is about prayer and meditation. My first when I listened in a step meeting and or some form of meeting, I heard early on, I didn't really understand it, but I heard early on, prayer is when I'm talking to God, meditation is when I'm listening to God. And I didn't hear it in the way I'm about to explain it until I did the steps in my fourth year. At the end of my fourth year, the beginning of my fifth year of sobriety, I asked the man to help me with the steps. It was an incredible life-changing experience. It took me through the big book. I'm reasonably intelligent, fairly well educated. Then I read English, but I could not, and I didn't know that I did not understand the big book. Step studies, book studies, I could do those because they were all academic and I'm fairly articulate. But I didn't really have an experience with them until I went through the steps with a man who understood the big book, but had also applied the steps to his personal life and had had a transforming spiritual awakening. And when he took me through the steps, I called him my step guide. He was a mechanic with the big book and the steps. I also then had a transformative experience, progressive. I was not aware of it as it was happening. Only after I had finished my ninth step, was practicing 10, 11, and 12, was I aware that I had been radically changed. Prayers when we're talking to God. All right. It's an intimate conversation. It's not about words. Please challenge your prayers. My God, I hear the Serenity Prayer prayed, blah, 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 blah. I hear the St. Francis prayer, blah, 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 blah. I don't hear any connection with the consciousness of the words and the intention of why we're praying it. Challenge yourself. Why am I praying? This man said to me, we don't pray to change God, Herb. Prayer changes the prayer. Prayer changes the prayer's consciousness, and eventually it seeps into the subconscious and we begin to be different. That was his explanation. He's not a trained person in any way in spirituality, but he had an experience. In fact, he got on his knees to pray. At that time, going through the work, I did that at his direction. I had studied to be a Catholic priest for 7 years in a monastery. I'd had enough of being on my knees. But he suggested I do that, and I did that because that was his suggestion, act contrary. I don't anymore since I finished that work with him. I don't do that. But he was a very successful, brilliant CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and he needed some ritual of humility. And that's, he said, it got my attention. It was an act of subordination. An intimate conversation, not about words, about intention. Why do we do it? To form a relationship, just like you would with a friend. You sit down, you have a cup of coffee, you take a walk, you have conversation. There's no structure. There's just coming from the soul, coming from the heart, once you've built that relationship through these kinds of conversations. Of course, it's really important what you believe about God. Steps 2 and 3, if you have any problem with meditation, it might be because of that, or it might be because you haven't had an experience with step 1. It's one or the other. Step 1 says, I don't have enough power. And every step after that says, I don't have enough power. Steps 2 and 3 are, there is a power that I can connect to. And step 3 says, I can have the hope of a connection. Wonderful. What do you believe about power? What do you believe about energy? What do you believe about life? About light? About God or higher power? What's your belief? If you believe you need help and you believe help's available and that you can establish a relationship, steps 1, 2, and 3, then you will be prepared to do step 11 as a daily practice. If you're not connected to any one of those steps 1, 2, or 3, you probably don't have a daily practice. The outcome, conscious contact, the total purpose of step 11. Sought, very active process. Sought. I'm a seeker. Fortunately, because of this work in 1988, I became a finder. Much better to be a finder than a seeker. Sought through prayer and meditation, two mechanisms. Prayer is not meditation. Meditation is not prayer. Prayer is when I'm talking. Meditation is when I'm listening. That's what it was said in that meeting, and I didn't understand it, but now I do, because this man helped me go through step 11 in the big book. The upon awakening part, it says, upon awakening, we ask God to direct our thinking. Meditation, defined in the dictionary, is directed thinking. Bill knew that. He had training from the Oxford group, which was about getting guidance, listening to my thinking. Meditation is thinking and then listening to my thinking. Well, why do we do this? Not because of physical health, although the science is conclusive. Not because of psychological health, although the science is conclusive. If you meditate, your body will be healthier. If you meditate, your emotions will be more balanced. Wonderful. Just not step 11. Step 11 has only one purpose, and it's theology, a relationship with the God of our understanding, or actually, more accurately put, the God of our not understanding. Bill tells us in step 11, in the material in the big book, the best description of meditation I've ever encountered, before doing the big book and after doing the big book. Susie mentioned step 11 is my favorite step. I've done more work and more recordings and more teachings and more presentations, and I'm more excited about any step than step 11, because it's the key to improving consciousness to live my life, but it's improving consciousness to have a relationship with life with a capital L. As I mentioned, Bill tells us in the very beginning of his explanation of meditation what to do in the evening. Inventory, not in writing. All right. It's an inventory following up on step 10, which is an inventory that recaps and repeats step 4. Step 4 is in writing. Bill's very clear about that. Step 10 is not in writing. Step 10 is not at night. Step 10 is when I'm disturbed on the spot. Step 11 is at night to figure out if I, in fact, did my step 10s in a healthy way. And what am I going to do tomorrow to correct whatever the vicissitudes of today were? My most favorite part, the morning, upon awakening. Bill's very simple. This man's instructions were very simple. I'm going to attempt to communicate very simply, because it opened the door for me. I left the monastery in 1964 after 7 years of training and meditating and teaching and practice. 7 years of silence. 1964, and I didn't meditate again for 25 years. See, because I didn't know what I was doing. When I took off my black robe, I'm not a monk. Monks meditate. I'm not a monk, so I don't meditate. Everything came from outside until I did this work, and now it's progressively come from the inside, where I'll talk more about that when we get to step 12 in terms of principles. Bill gives us two directions. Think about the 24 hours ahead, consider your plans. Think about the 24 hours ahead. He doesn't tell us what that means. Consider your plans. He doesn't tell us what it means. I make up a definition because I want to implement what Bill is suggesting. And so I literally think think about my thinking is about my calendar for the day, my behavior, the activities for the day. Whereas consider my plans for the day, I translate as my intention, my attitude, my very being. Think about the 24 hours a day as looking at my day planner. In metaphorically in my mind, or even literally opening it up, I have it with me when I meditate. I make notes if I need to remind me of doing the things that I wanted to do to improve my own humanity and to contribute to the humanity around me. Consider my plans for the day. Yesterday I was a little edgy, but today I'm going to try to be smooth. Yesterday I was cranky. I'll try to get more sleep tonight. Yesterday I was very distracted. Today I'll be more mindful, more aware of the presence of God. That's the kind of thinking I do at this point in my morning practice. But the man said, looking at the big book, quoting Bill, he said, Bill said, we ask God to direct our thinking. He said, ask God is a direction for prayer. Anytime we're talking to God, a direction for prayer. He said, it's this simple, Herb. God, please direct my thinking. Then we think, and then we consider. Now here, if you hear only one thing today, this one thing, it's the key to unlock the treasure chest of meditation. I'd never heard it before. I rarely hear it after, but it allowed me, it's not in the big book, it allowed me to establish the beginning of a daily practice, which I've had now since 1989. When I finished this work, I was getting the instructions on step 11. I have been reasonably consistent on a daily basis now that I know what to do. And he said, we ask God to direct our thinking. God, please direct my thinking. Then we think about the day, my activity. We consider my plans for the day, my being. And here's the word. And we listen to our thinking as the possible medium of the message from God. God does not talk to me, at least audibly through my ears. But when I listen to my thinking, when I listen to my feelings, when I watch my memories and my imagination or my sensations around the reflections that I'm doing about my day and my activities and my being and who I want to be as a decent human being, I'm actively thinking about these things. Then I watch. I stand above. I transcend my thinking, watching my thinking as the possible message from God, because that's what I asked for. God, please direct my thinking. Bill suggests that this is the proper use of the mind and that we learn to live on inspiration. And all day long, be awake. Pause when agitated. Pause when in doubt. Pause when we need some more direction. The other word that Bill doesn't use in the big book, but that was the key word he learned in the Oxford group, was guidance. Bill and Bob and the intention of step 11, I believe, comes from the Oxford group's focus on meditation for guidance for the day and guidance for their life. The step itself says to improve our conscious contact, to become more aware of. In the appendix 2 in the back of the book, when he describes a spiritual awakening, he talks about awareness of the presence of God is the essence of a spiritual experience. Awareness of the presence of God is the essence of a spiritual experience. You hear the phrase, and I have it on the PowerPoint translated differently, we small voice. It's a wonderful translation, but it's not accurate. I went back about several years ago to look at some people who do translations, I don't have that kind of language expertise, but they said wee small voice is a good translation. It's just not the best. The best translation is tiny whispering sound. It sounds similar, but when you unpack that, there's no voice. There's just this something that is captured in the word whispering sound. That's why we be quiet. That's why we be silent. That's why we listen to our thinking and our feelings and our imagination and anything else that we're conscious of that's going on in response to the prayer. Sometimes, and Bill says in step 11 in the 12 and 12, a wonderful chapter on an alternate approach. He says, read the St. Francis prayer, one word, one phrase at a time, and then listen. Think about what's its invitation? What is it trying to tell us about our current life and consciousness or lack thereof? We're using our mind to pay attention. We're using our mind to think and get guidance. Bill uses the terms throughout the book, but especially in this 2.5 pages, 85 to 88, intuition, inspiration, instinct, all coming from different sources. Our mind, our heart, our gut. The point is, and it says it right at the end of step 11, don't overlook the last couple phrases. They're just so powerful. Praying for knowledge of God's will and the power to carry it out. A complete antidote to unmanageability. My definition of unmanageability is I do what I don't want to do and I don't do what I want to do. Embedded in that is sometimes I don't know what to do and I don't know that I don't know what to do and I'm completely delusional. Oh yeah, that still happens today. Not grossly and not as frequently, of course. Well, maybe I think you know what I mean by of course. Once you start improving your consciousness and you're progressive with your leaning into the practice of consciousness, you become more conscious. But we never become perfect. Practice makes progress. Practice never makes perfect because we're material beings. Only immaterial can be perfect, and that's what part of the way that we look at the God of our not understanding. Praying for knowledge, what to do. Praying for strength, the ability to actually do it. Improving awareness is an invitation. It's a consciousness practice. Step 10 is a practice of emotional sobriety. Step 11, you could say it's emotional sobriety because of consciousness. I don't want to get too bogged down in definitions, but I do use the term spiritual sobriety here because I'm in now a relationship with and a practice of awareness of the spirit. Bill tells us to meditate at night in inventory and to meditate in the morning for guidance, my terms, trying to understand the structure of step 11. If you want to outline it, it outlines very nicely what to do at night, what to do in the morning, and what to do all day long. Most teachers about meditation, whatever the tradition is, talk about 20 minutes is a solid practice. If you don't have a practice and you want to have a practice, start with 1 minute. Well, it's not enough. Well, it's 1 minute more than you're doing. That's my conversation with people. And once you have a habit of or a practice of doing 1 minute, not of reading, not of writing, not of praying, 1 minute of intentional, conscious listening to your thinking, then allow the spirit to lead you to 2 minutes or 5 minutes. And eventually, if you trust the multitude of teachers over the multitude of centuries, about 20 minutes is probably a good solid daily practice. Bill suggests twice a day. I've never been that consistent with the evening practice. I have some practice, but my morning practice is the most fulfilling practice that I have. One of my teachers said, the only mistake you can make is not to show up and to leave early. Use a timer. If you're worried about the time, use a timer. I had to do that when I was working. I didn't want to get lost, and I didn't want to be thinking about the time. The timer tells me when I'm done. Show up, but don't leave early. It's a method, not a technique. This is not like a magic wand or fairy dust. This is a very human behavior of improving consciousness, showing up and leaning into the light, leaning against the dimmer switch. An action based on faith. I made that comment at the beginning. What's the assumption about steps 2 and 3? Not about certitude, not about knowledge, not about feeling. It's an awareness of the presence of God and a decision that that's not delusional, that that's really true. And that's my act of faith, and that's my act of hope. Step 2, an act of faith. Step 3, an act of hope, as I translate it. An experience, not a task, not a duty, not a responsibility. Oh, I have to do because my sponsor said. Oh, I have to do because it's step 11. No, you don't have to. How conscious do you want to be? How free do you want to be? How soon do you want to be free? How soon do you want to be conscious? This is about receiving light. My current favorite metaphor is the cell phone. My cell phone gets charged every night because I want it to be of service to me during the day. I used to use the golf cart. I don't play golf, so it wasn't my experience, but the cell phone is. My cell phone needs daily charging. Otherwise, it's useless. Is that true for me? Is that true for you? Do you need to have power by plugging into power in order to be useful to yourself and to others? That's spiritual sobriety. I think that's it for right now. I have a prayer at the end, if in fact, and I changed it again, Susie, if you want me to pray a prayer at the end, but that's my half of my journey. By the beginning of 1989, I was into a daily practice. The following year, I met a Trappist monk, Father Thomas Keating, and he introduced me to contemplation, which reconnected me to my own personal monastic experience, and gave it some meaning and gave it some traction so that I could incorporate that into my step 11. It's not anticipated even in the big book, but it is my experience, and I think it might be a helpful conversation for a lot of people who, in fact, may have some form of a contemplative practice, a Buddhist practice, a transcendental meditation practice, which are, in fact, all in the same genre. And if you don't, it'll at least give you some exposure and some understanding of that particular method. Thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Herb.